The president's son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner, is dismissing the findings of the Mueller report. In an interview with Time magazine Tuesday morning, he called the speculation about it worse than the investigation itself. He also said the investigation had a harsher impact on our democracy than Russia buying a couple of Facebook ads. His remarks come as Democrats are divided on the question of impeachment. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has urged caution on moving too fast, but other Democrats want to start the proceedings. Natalie Brand has more on the mixed messaging and how 2020 candidates are weighing in.
Some Democrats, including presidential candidates, say Congress should begin impeachment proceedings against President Trump. Special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation outlined 10 different incidents that could be viewed as evidence of possible obstruction of justice.
If any other human being in this country had done what's documented in the Mueller report, they would be arrested and put in jail.
I believe Congress should take the steps towards impeachment.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says she's not there yet, telling party members on a conference call Monday, we don't have to go to articles of impeachment to obtain the facts. On CBS this morning, Republican Senator Mike Lee said it would be a mistake for Democrats to try and remove the president from office with the 2020 presidential election around the corner.
When you impeach, you often end up unwittingly strengthening the executive branch and strengthening the executive in office at the time.
President Trump has repeatedly brushed off talk of impeachment.
Are you worried about impeachment, Mr. President?
A little bit.
While the president does not appear concerned, Democrats want to hear from former White House counsel Don McGahn. Jerry Nadler, the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, has issued a subpoena for testimony and documents from McGahn, who Nadler described as a critical witness to many of the alleged instances of obstruction of justice. Natalie Brand, CBS News, Washington, D.C.
For more, I want to bring in Andrew Desiderio. He's a congressional reporter for Politico. So, Andrew, what's the sense here? Why do you think Nancy Pelosi is sort of holding her fire and her stance against impeachment, even as there's more and more pressure from within her party?
I think it's more of a political calculation than a legal or ethical calculation. Nancy Pelosi knows, first off, the facts of the case, which is that you cannot move an impeachment successfully through the Senate. So there's really no sense in trying, and you could end up unwittingly strengthening the president's bid for re-election in 2020 if you go down this path. So she's in a tough position, even as more and more rank-and-file Democrats are starting to agitate more toward impeachment and get closer to it. On a conference call yesterday for House Democrats to discuss the Mueller report, for example, Congresswoman Val Demings, who sits on the Judiciary Committee, was saying to her colleagues, essentially, we have enough to start impeachment proceedings right now. So I think a voice like her, someone who's been in law enforcement for a long time and has been more measured on this impeachment issue than most, the fact that she's changed her tune, I think, is reflective of the mood of the caucus right now.
So with that in mind, how long do you think Nancy Pelosi can hold folks in the Democratic Party, at bay on this issue?
Well, I think there's going to be continued pressure, obviously, from Nancy Pelosi's left flank, the progressive activist base that's saying, you got to do this right now. That pressure is always going to be there, but I think it's a question of whether there's enough pressure from within the House Democratic caucus and more people like, for example, Congresswoman Val Demings, come out and say, look, we need to start doing this, especially people like Demings who sit on the Judiciary Committee. Remember, the Judiciary Committee has the power at any time to formally launch these impeachment proceedings. The Judiciary Committee is already investigating obstruction of justice against the president, for example, and that's one avenue for them.
So in addition to Demings, House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler is really focused on the president. Yesterday, he even issued a subpoena for former White House counsel Don McGahn, as you mentioned. So will this kind of information that the committee is seeking, will they ultimately get what they're asking for?
Well, it's unclear. So he issued the subpoena yesterday, and he wants McGahn to not only provide many, many documents, he wants McGahn to testify in public on May 21st. Of course, McGahn is emerging as a central witness in the Mueller investigation and in Congress's own investigation into obstruction of justice. He was, of course, a critical witness. He personally witnessed and memorialized via his own notes instances that could be described as obstruction of justice by by the president, most notably when the president tried to convince McGahn, or tried to get McGahn, order him rather, to fire the special counsel. So he's again emerging as a central witness. We don't know yet whether he's going to accept the invitation to testify. Actually, it's not even an invitation, it's a demand to testify because it has the strength of a subpoena behind it, but that remains to be seen. He wants, Nadler wants McGahn in on May 21st.
So yesterday, President Trump actually filed a lawsuit to block the House Oversight Committee subpoena of his financial records. It's not the first time the administration hasn't complied with the subpoena. They've ignored requests for security clearance, the AT&T merger. So how does Congress at this point really have recourse?
Well, first off, a congressional subpoena is really the end-all, be-all when it comes to these investigations, right? So in terms of challenging a congressional subpoena, those court battles are often very difficult, even though they can take a while. So the Trump legal team's strategy here might be to just, drag this on as much as they possibly can to try to, take Democrats off their toes, or just, essentially derail these investigations. But this is the first time that they are actually bringing litigation to challenge these congressional requests. Before, it was simply not answering or not providing documents, but now that many of these requests have the strength of a subpoena behind them, the administration, or rather the Trump legal team, his outside counsel, is finally resorting to litigation. And I think we're going to see this more and more, especially with today being the deadline for the president, for the Treasury Department and the IRS to hand over the president's tax returns to the House Ways and Means Committee.
So will this all end up in court?
Yeah, it absolutely will. On the issue of the subpoena for the president's financial records from accounting firm Mazars USA, the president's attorneys have already asked for an emergency ruling on the issue by Monday, because they worry that Mazars USA, the accounting firm, will comply with the subpoena to hand over the president's financial records by then. So that's something that they're worried about. It could happen as soon as I said, Monday, but these court battles can often take months.
And, speaking of subpoena and all this talk, when you're talking about 2020 candidates, Senators Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris said that they actually support impeachment during last night's CNN town hall. But, you've got Senators Amy Klobuchar, Bernie Sanders. They had a different view.
The impeachment proceedings are up to the House. They're going to have to make that decision. I am in the Senate, and I believe that we are the jury. I've always believed this from the beginning to the end. I'm a former prosecutor. I believe you look at the evidence to make decisions. So if the House brings the impeachment proceedings before us, we will deal with them.
If for the next year, year and a half, going right into the heart of the election, all that the Congress is talking about is impeaching Trump and Trump and Mueller, and we're not talking about health care. We're not talking about raising the minimum wage to a living wage. We're not talking about combating climate change. We're not talking about sexism and racism and homophobia and all of the issues that concern ordinary Americans. What I worry about is that works to Trump's advantage.
So is there a sense of who has the winning messaging strategy on impeachment?
Well, the politics of impeachment are rapidly changing, as we've seen over the last couple days within the House Democratic caucus, but that has also waded its way into the 2020 presidential candidates. Obviously, many of them would say the obvious answer of, look, I want to beat President Trump in 2020 at the ballot box. I don't want to focus on any of these other ancillary issues. But it's quickly becoming a 2020 litmus test of sorts for progressives, because the progressive base of the Democratic Party, the activist base in particular, has been hot on this issue for a very long time now. And I think what you saw was Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris and some other candidates addressing that frustration head on and trying to get out in front of it as sort of a litmus test in their own presidential primary.
Now that we're moving on from the Mueller report, you saw these 2020 candidates make policy their focus. We heard just a short time ago from Bernie Sanders. Was there anything in particular that stood out to you from what you heard last night?
Right. I think what stood out to me was what didn't stand out. The fact that there weren't that many ideological distinctions, ideological differences among the candidates. Everybody was talking about, this idea of letting convicted felons vote and letting people who are currently in jail vote. That was, I guess, a point where you saw the candidates openly disagreeing, I guess. But I don't think that's going to be a prevailing theme of the 2020 campaign. They all largely agree on policies, on messaging, and I I think a lot of these disagreements sometimes get overblown, and they are on, like I said, these ancillary issues that aren't as important to voters, and that voters aren't directly casting their ballots about. So I think the main thing that my takeaway was that what we didn't see was more important, which was the vast ideological differences among the field.
You know, our Ed O'Keefe is reporting that former Vice President Joe Biden will announce his candidacy on Thursday. What are you hearing about his rollout?
Right, so it looks like they were intending to roll it out tomorrow, but they had to push it back a little bit. We don't know the reasons why, but Joe Biden's going to face some tough questions. He's obviously going to occupy the more centrist, pragmatic lane within the party as he announces. He's going to try to roll out endorsements, play to his strengths in terms of blue-collar workers, unions, and everything, and he's going to try to amplify that message on Thursday. But a lot of his past is going to come back to haunt him in a Democratic primary field that is much more progressive, much more liberal than it has been in the past. And I think that's something that he's going to have to deal with head-on, and I have a feeling that he's already crafted how he's going to respond to those charges.
Andrew Desiderio. Andrew, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.